In the last video we uploaded, I talked about how brake technique separates the great drivers from the good drivers. There are a couple concepts discussed in that last video that we really need to go into more detail on. Consider this part 2 of that first video. So 2 concepts from that first video I want to elaborate on. One is brake pressure modulation, and 2 is experimenting with the brakes. Shown here is the graphical representation of a brake pressure data trace if we're running a data system. Even if you're not running a data system, this is being shown to provide us with visual and mental reference of what we're aiming for during the 3 main phases of the brake sequence. That being the initial brake point, some period of threshold braking, and the release of the brakes. And a reminder, for all the inputs that we're given the chassis, be it steering, brake, or throttle, we want to think smooth and balanced so we can give the chassis time to respond to our inputs. If we're too quick, we upset the chassis. Being smooth and balanced with our inputs helps the chassis remain compliant and helps it respond to the inputs that we're giving it. The initial brake point is a point at which we come off the throttle as quickly as possible and then smoothly and deliberately and quickly apply the brakes, building to maximum pressure. And we don't romp on the brakes, but we smoothly and quickly and deliberately apply the brakes, building to maximum pressure. Maximum pressure is defined as a point at which we reach the rotational limit of the tires. That meaning, if the car is going 100 miles per hour, the tires are rotating about 96 miles per hour, giving us about 4% of slip. This is also called threshold braking. So like laterally, when you're cornering, you get some lateral slip from the tires. Longitudinally, under brakes, under threshold braking, you get some longitudinal slip from the tires. And this is typically in the range of about 6 to 10%. We then maintain this threshold braking for some period of time, sufficient enough to remove enough speed and energy from the car so that we can begin to release the brakes, freeing up grip laterally that we can use to help the car turn. Building to this threshold braking does take some seat time and practice, but you can tell when you're threshold braking because under brakes, you get a little bit of wiggle underneath you from the chassis. This next phase of the brake sequence, or the release of the brakes, is what separates the great drivers from the good drivers. And this is the phase where we begin to fine-tune the chassis as we begin to enter the corner. Shown here is a traction circle of a newer driver who's been taught to get all their braking done in a straight line. They initially apply the brakes in a straight line, release the brakes in a straight line, and then begin turn-in. But as a result, this driver is leaving a lot of unused available grip on the table that he or she could have used to enter the corner at a higher rate of speed. Conversely, here's a more experienced driver who was able to use more of the tire's available grip on corner entry. They initially brake in a straight line, then as they initially come off the brakes, releasing lateral grip on the tires, they're able to begin turn-in and trail brake through the rest of the corner, using more of the tire's available grip, entering this corner at a higher rate of speed. This is an idealized plot, but this is the goal, is use as much of the tire's available grip on corner entry as possible. So for trail braking and to make more use of the tire's available grip, after threshold braking and initial release of the brakes, releasing some lateral grip in the tires, the driver is then able to use that lateral grip and begin turn-in. So to conceptualize the timing of this, of trail braking, to conceptualize the timing is imagine a string's attached from your steering wheel down your brake pedal. So threshold braking, initial release of the brakes, releasing lateral grip, the driver then turns in and releases the brakes at the same rate. Now where the magic happens on the great drivers is the last 15 to 20% of braking is they can control that rate, either getting the car to rotate more or rotate less, depending on what that corner and the next sequence of corners demands. Now I just touched on it, but now we can talk about experiment with the brakes. And we can experiment with all 3 phases of the brake zone, being the release of the brakes, threshold braking, and the initial brake point. And there's a reason I'm stating it in that order, because the release of the brakes is the most crucial part of the brake zone. It's the point where we come off the brakes and apply throttle and get to wide open throttle. We want to be on wide open throttle as soon as possible in the corner. The earlier we're at wide open throttle, we'll have higher engine RPMs at the exit, upshift sooner heading to our next brake zone, and enter our next brake zone going at a higher rate of speed, lowering our lap time for that segment. One here is turns 2 and 3 at Hallett. Turn 2 at Hallett is a very low speed 120-degree corner followed by a quick chicane at turn 3. So a driver coming into this corner with no knowledge of the chicane at 3 would release the brakes here, very low trail braking, and then get back to throttle. But as you can see here, the driver still needing to apply some steering input as they're applying throttle. So with a subtle 10% tweak in this segment, the driver could release the brakes here, trail brake a little bit more through 2, helping the car to rotate, getting the car pointed straight at the apex of 2 and 3. You can be wide open throttle before the apex of 2, clip the apex of 3, exiting this sequence at a higher rate of speed. And this experimentation applies to your initial brake point as well. The brake pressure data trace shown earlier in this video is really for a low speed corner. For medium and high speed corner, you typically want to brake a little bit lighter, mainly just to brush the brakes a little bit, just get some weight transferred to the front tires, just to help the car to make the corner. And you can experiment with this initial brake point. You can maybe brake a little bit later and a little bit harder, extending that previous straight, or maybe brake a little bit earlier and lighter so you maybe get to back to wide open throttle sooner. Experiment, a little 5 to 10% tweaks and experiment, and then see what works. If something worked, do more of that. If something didn't work as well, then do less of that. So not all corners are the same. Some are low speed corners, some are high speed. Some are decreasing radius, some are increasing radius. Some there's a sequence of corners to follow which we also need to address. And some brake zones tend uphill and some tend downhill, which will either compress or decompress the suspension, which we also need to take into consideration. Key is to experiment, 5 to 10% tweaks, experiment with each phase of the brake zone and see what works. See when you get to wide open throttle, then make modifications from there. Even if there's a track that you've been to before several times and are very familiar with, take 1 or 2 corners and just experiment with each of the 3 phases. You might discover speed. If you watch this video all the way to here, I sincerely appreciate you. Be sure to click subscribe and ring the bell to get alerted when we upload new content geared to help you tune the chassis and the nut behind the wheel. You. As always, be safe, go fast, and have fun. Peace.